application, and perseverance. The greatest results in life are usually attained by simple means and the exercise of ordinary qualities. The common life of every day, with its cares, necessities, and duties, affords ample opportunity for acquiring experience of the best kind, and its most beaten paths provideth true worker with abundant scope for effort and room for self-improvement. The road of human welfare lies along the old highway of steadfast well-doing, and they who are the most persistent and work in the truest spirit will usually be the most successful. Fortune has often been blamed for her blindness, but fortune is not so blind as men are. Those who look into practical life will find fortune is usually on the side of the industrious, as the winds and waves are on the side of the best navigators. In the pursuit of even the highest branches of human inquiry, the commoner qualities are found the most useful, such as common sense, attention, application, and perseverance. Genius may not be necessary, though even genius of the highest sort does not disdain the use of these ordinary qualities. The very greatest men have been among the least believers in the power of genius, and as worldly wise and persevering as successful men of the commoner sort. Some have even defined genius to be only common sense intensified. A distinguished teacher and president of a college spoke of it as the power of making efforts. John Foster held it to be the power of lighting one's own fire. Buffon said of genius, "It is patience." Newton's was unquestionably a mind of the very highest order, and yet, when asked by what means he had worked out his extraordinary discoveries, he modestly answered, "By always thinking unto them." At another time, Hethus expressed his method of study: "I keep the subject continual before me, and wait till the first dawnings open slowly by little and little into a full and clear light." It was in Newton's case, as in every other, only by diligent application and perseverance that his great reputation was achieved. Even his recreation consisted in change of study, laying down one subject to take up another. To Dr. Bentley Hesed, "If I have done the public any service, it is due to nothing but industry and patient thought." So Kepler, another great philosopher, speaking of his studies and his progress, sighed, "As in Virgil, fam mobilitate vigit, vires acquirit jundo." So it was with me that the diligent thought on these things was the occasion of still further thinking, until at last I brooded with the whole energy of my mind upon the subject, the extraordinary. Results effected by dint of sheer industry and perseverance have led many distinguished men to doubt whether the gift of genius be so exceptional an endowment as it is usually supposed to be. Thus Voltaire held that it is only a very slight line of separation that divides the man of genius from the man of ordinary mold. Beccaria was even of opinion that all men might be poets and orators, and Reynolds that they might be painters and sculptors. If this were really so, that stolid Englishman might not have been so very far wrong after all, who, on Canova's death, inquired of his brother whether it was his intention to carry on the business. Locke, Helvetius, and Diderot believed fatal men have an equal aptitude for genius, and that what some are able to effect under the laws which regulate the operations of the intellect must also be within the reach of others who, under like circumstances, apply themselves to like pursuits. But while admitting to the fullest extent the wonderful achievements of labor, and recognizing the fact that men of the most distinguished genius have invariably been found the most indefatigable workers, it must nevertheless be sufficiently obvious that, without the original endowment of heart and brain, no amount of labor, however well applied, could have produced a Shakespeare, a Newton, a Beethoven, or a Michelangelo. Dalton, the chemist, repudiated the notion of his being a genius, attributing everything which he had accomplished to simple industry and accumulation. John Hunter said of himself, "My mind is like a beehive, but full as it is of buzz and apparent confusion, it is yet full of order and regularity. and food collected with incessant industry from the choicest stores in nature. We have indeed, but to glance at the biographies of great men, to find that the most distinguished inventors, artists, thinkers, and workers of all kinds owe their success, in a great measure, to their indefatigable industry and application. They were men who turned all things to gold, even time itself. Disraeli Fielder held that the secret of success consisted in being master of your subject, such mastery being attainable only through continuous application and study. Hence it happens that the men who have most moved the world have not been so much men of genius, strictly so called, as men of intense mediocre abilities and untiring perseverance. Not Sufin the gifted, of naturally bright and shining qualities, as those who have applied themselves diligently to their work, in whatsoever line that might lie. Alas, said a widow, speaking of her brilliant but careless son, he has not the gift of continuance. Wanting in perseverance, such volatile natures are outstripped in the race of life by the diligent and even the dull. Che va piano, vi longano, e va lontano, says the Italian proverb. Who goes slowly, goes long, and goes far. Hence, a great point to be aimed at is to get the working quality well trained. When that is done, the race will be found comparatively easy. We must repeat and again repeat. Facility will come with labor. Note, even the simplest art can be accomplished without it. And what difficulties it is found capable of achieving. It was by early discipline and repetition that the late Sir Robert Peel cultivated thus remarkable, though still mediocre powers, which rendered him so illustrious an ornament of the British Senate. When a boy at Drayton Manor, his father was accustomed to set him up at table to practice speaking extempore, and he early accustomed him to repeat as much of the Sunday's sermon as he could remember. Little progress was made at first, but by steady perseverance, the habit of attention became powerful, and the sermon was at length repeated almost verbatim. When afterwards replying, in succession to the arguments of his parliamentary opponents entered, in which he was, perhaps unrivaled, it was little surmised that the extraordinary power of accurate remembrance which he displayed on such occasions had been originally trained under the discipline of his father in the parish church of Drayton. It is indeed marvelous what continuous application will effect in the commonest of things. It may seem a simple affair to play upon a violin, yet what a long and laborious practice it requires. Giardini said to Eyolf, who asked him how long it would take to learn it, 12 hours a day for 20 years together. Industry, it is said, underscore fate, lure stancer underscore. The poor figurant must devote years of incessant toil to her profitless task before she can shine in it. When Taglioni was preparing us for her evening exhibition, she would, after a severe 2 hours lesson from her father, fall down exhausted and had to be undressed, sponged, and resuscitated totally unconscious. The agility and bounds off the evening were ensured only at a price like this. Progress, however, of the best kind, is comparatively slow. Great results cannot be achieved at once, and we must be satisfied to advance in life as we walk, step by step. Demostre says that to know underscore how to wait underscore is the great secret of success. We must sow before we can reap, and often have to wait long, content meanwhile to look patiently forward in hope. The fruit best worth waiting for often ripening the slowest. But time and patience, says the Eastern proverb, change the mulberry leaf to satin. To wait patiently, however, men must work cheerfully. Cheerfulness is an excellent working quality, imparting great elasticity to the character. As a bishop has said, temper is 9/10 of Christianity. So are cheerfulness and diligence 9/10 of practical wisdom. They are the life and soul of success, as well as of happiness. Perhaps the very highest pleasure in life consisting in clear, brisk, conscious working. Energy, confidence, and every other good quality mainly depending upon it. Sidney Smith, when laboring as a parish priest at Foston-le-Clay in Yorkshire, though he did not feel himself to be in his preparation, went cheerfully to work in the firm determination to do his best. "I am resolved," he said, "to like it and reconcile myself to it, which is more manly than to feign myself above it, and to send up complaints by the post of being thrown away, and being desolate, and such like trash. So Dr. Hook, when leaving Leeds for a new sphere of labor, said, wherever I may be, I shall, by God's blessing, do with my might what my hand findeth to do. And if I do not find work, I shall make it. Laborers for the public good especially have to work long and patiently, often uncheered by the prospect of immediate recompense or result. The seeds they sow sometimes lie hidden under the winter's snow, and before the spring comes, the husbandman may have gone to his rest. It is not every public worker who, like Rowland Hill, sees his great idea bring forth fruit in his lifetime. Adam Smith sowed the seeds of a great social amelioration in that dingy old University of Glasgow, where he so long labored and laid the foundations of his wealth of nations. But 70 years passed before his work bore substantial fruits, nor indeed are they all gathered in yet. Nothing can compensate for the loss of hope in a man. It entirely changes character. "How can I work? How can I be happy?" said a great but miserable thinker, "when I have lost all hope?" One of the most cheerful and courageous, because one of the most hopeful of workers, was Carey, the missionary. When in India, it was no uncommon thing for him to weary out 3 pundits, who officiated as his clerks, in one day, he himself taking rest only in change of employment. Carey, the son of a shoemaker, was supported in his labors by Ward, the son of a carpenter, and Marshall, the son of a weaver. By their labors, a magnificent col was erected at Serampore. 16 flourishing stations were re-established. The Bible was translated into 16 languages, and seeds were sown of a beneficent moral revolution in British India. Carey was never ashamed of the humbleness of his origin. On one occasion, when at the Governor-General's table, he overheard an officer opposite high-masking another, loud enough to be heard, whether Carey had not once been a shoemaker. "No, sir," exclaimed Carey immediately, "only a cobbler." An eminently characteristic anecdote has been told of his perseverance as a boy. When climbing a tree one day, his foot slipped, and he fell to the ground, breaking his leg by the fall. He was confined to his bed for weeks, but when he recovered and was able to walk without support, the very first thing he did was to go and climb that tree. Carey had need of this sort of dauntless courage for the great missionary work of his life, and nobly and resolutely he did it. It was a maxim of Dr. Young, the philosopher, that any man can do what any other man has done, and it is unquestionable that he himself never recoiled from any trials to which he determined to subject himself. It is related of him that the first time he mounted a horse, he was in company with the grandson of Mr. Barclay of Uri, the well-known sportsman, when the horseman who preceded them leaped the high fence. Young wished to imitate him, but fell off his horse in the attempt. Without saying a word, he remounted, made a second effort, and was again unsuccessful, but this time he was not thrown further than on to the horse's neck, to which he clung. At the third trial, he succeeded, and cleared the fence. The story of Timur the Tartar learning, a lesson of perseverance under adversity from the spider, is well known. Not less interesting is the anecdote of Audubon, the American ornithologist, as related by himself. "An accident," he says, "which happened to 200 of my original drawings, nearly put a stop to my researches in ornithology. I shall relate it, merely to show how far enthusiasm for, by no other name can, equal my perseverance, may enable the preserver of nature to surmount the most disheartening difficulties. I left the village of Henderson, in Kentucky, situated on the banks of the Ohio, where I resided for several years, to proceed to Philadelphia on business. I looked to my drawings bear my departure, placed them carefully in a wooden box, and gave them in charge of a relative, with injunctions to see that no injury should happen to them. My absence was of several months, and when I returned, after having enjoyed the pleasures of home for a few days, I inquired after my box and what I was pleased to call my treasure. The box was produced and opened. But reader, feel for me a pair of Norway rats had taken possession of the whole, and reared a young family among the gnawed bits of paper, which, but a month previous, represented nearly 1,000 inhabitants of air. The burning beat which instantly rushed through my brain was too great to be endured without affecting my whole nervous system. I slept for several nights, and the days passed like days of oblivion until the animal powers being recalled into action through the strength of my constitution, I took up my gun, my notebook, and my pencils, and went forth to the woods as gaily as if nothing had happened. I felt pleased that I might now make better drawings than before, and ere a period not exceeding 3 years had elapsed, my portfolio was again filled. The accidental destruction of Sir Isaac Newton's papers by his little diamond upsetting a lighted taper upon his desk, by which the elaborate calculations of many years were in a moment destroyed, is a well-known anecdote, and need not be repeated. It is said that the loss caused the philosopher such profound grief that it seriously injured his health and impaired his understanding. An accident of a somewhat similar kind happened to the MS of Mr. Carlyle's first volume of his French Revolution. He had lent the MS to a literary neighbor Taparouse. By some mischance, it had been left lying on the parlor floor and become forgotten. Weeks ran on, and the historian sent for his work, the printers being loud for copy. Inquiries were made, and it was found that the maid of all work, finding what she conceived to be a bundle of waste paper on the floor, had used it to light the kitchen and parlor fires with. Such was the answer returned to Mr. Carlyle, and his feelings may be imagined. There was, however, no help for him but to sit resolutely to work to rewrite the book, and he turned to and did it. He had no draft, and was compelled to rake up from his memory facts, ideas, and expressions which had been long since dismissed. The composition of the book in the first instance had been a work of pleasure. The writing of it a second time was one of pain and anguish almost beyond belief. That he persevered and finished the volume under such circumstances affords an instance of determination of purpose which has seldom been surpassed. Lives of eminent inventors are eminently illustrative of the same quality of perseverance. George Stephenson, when addressing young men, was accustomed to sum up his best advice to them in the words, "Do as I have done, persevere." He had worked at the improvement of his locomotiver some 15 years before achieving his decisive victory at Rainhill, and Watt was engaged for some 30 years upon the condensing engine of Bohr. He brought it to perfection. But there are equally striking illustrations of perseverance to be found in every other branch of science, art, and industry. Perhaps one of the most interesting is that connected with the disentombment of the Nineveh marbles, and the discovery of the long-lost cuneiform or arrow-headed character, in which inscriptions on them are written, a kind of writing which had been lost to the world since the period of the Macedonian conquest of Persia. An intelligent cadet of the East India Company, stationed at Kermanshah in Persia, had observed the curious cuneiform inscriptions on the old monuments in the neighborhood, so old that all historical traces of them had been lost. And amongst the inscriptions which he copied was that celebrated rock of Behistana, perpendicular rock rising abruptly some 1,700 feet from the plain, the lower part bearing inscriptions for Thespes of about 300 feet in 3 languages: Persian, Scythian, and Assyrian. Comparison of the known with the unknown, of the language survived with the language that had been lost, enabled this cadetto acquire some knowledge of the cuneiform character, and even to form an alphabet. Mr. afterwards Sir Henry Rawlinson sent his tracings home for examination. No professors in colleges as yet knew anything of the cuneiform character, but there was a C.I. von Clerk of the East India House, a modest unknown man of the name of Norris, who had made this little understood subject his study, to whom the tracings were submitted. And so accurate was his knowledge that, though he had never seen the Behistun rock, he pronounced that the cadet had not copied the puzzling inscription with proper exactness. Rawlinson, who was still in the neighborhood of the rock, compared his copy with the original and found that Norris was right. And by further comparison and careful study, the knowledge of the cuneiform writing was thus greatly advanced. But to make the learning of these two self-taught men of avail, a third laborer was necessary in order to supply them with material for the exercise of their skill. Such a laborer presented himself in the person of Austin Layard, originally an articled clerk in the office of a London solicitor. One would scarcely have expected to find in these three men, a cadet, an India House clerk, and a lawyer's clerk, the discoverers of a forgotten language and of the buried history of Babylon. Yet it was so. Layard was a youth of only 22, traveling in the East, when he was possessed with a desire to penetrate the regions beyond the Euphrates. Accompanied by a single companion, trusting to his arms for protection, and what was better, to his cheerfulness, politeness, and chivalrous bearing, he passed safely amidst tribes at deadly war with each other. And after the lapse of many years, with comparatively slender means at his command, but aided by application and perseverance, resolute will and purpose, and almost sublime patience, borne up throughout by his passionate enthusiasm for discovery and research, has succeeded in laying bare and digging up an amount of historical treasures, the like of which has probably never before been collected by the industry of any one man. Not less than 2 miles of bas-reliefs were thus brought to light by Mr. Layard. The selection of these valuable antiquities, now placed in the British Museum, was found so curious, like a rebochet of the scriptural records of events which occurred some 3,000 years ago, that they burst upon the world almost like a new revelation. And the story of the disentombment of these remarkable works, as told by Mr. Layard himself in his Monuments of Nineveh, will always be regarded as one of the most charming and unaffected records we possess of individual enterprise, industry, and energy. The career of the Comte de Buffon presents another remarkable illustration of the power of patient industry, as well as of his own saying, that genius is patience. Notwithstanding the great results achieved by him in natural history, Buffon, when a youth, was regarded as of mediocre talents. His mind was slow in forming itself, and slow in reproducing what it had acquired. He was also constitutionally indolent, and being born to good estate, it might be supposed that he would indulge his liking for ease and luxury. Instead of which, he early formed the resolution of denying himself pleasure and devoting himself to study and self-culture, regarding time as a treasure that was limited, and finding that he was losing many hours by lying abed in the mornings, he determined to break himself of the habit. He struggled hard against it for some time, but failed in being able to rise at the hour he had fixed. He then called his servant, Joseph, to his help, and promised him the reward of a crown every time that he succeeded in getting him up before 6. At first, when called, Buffon declined to rise, pleaded that he was ill, or pretended anger at being disturbed. And on the count at length getting up, Joseph found that he had earned nothing but reproaches for having permitted his master to lie abed contrary to his express orders. At length the valet determined to earn his crown, and again have forced Buffon to rise, notwithstanding his entreaties, expostulations, and threats of immediate discharge from his service. One morning Buffon was unusually obstinate, and Joseph found it necessary to resort to the extreme measure of dashing a basin of ice-cold water under Thebed clothes, the effect of which was instantaneous. By the persistent use of such means, Buffon at length conquered his habit, and he was accustomed to say that he owed to Joseph 3 or 4 volumes of his natural history. For 40 years of his life, Buffon worked every morning at his desk from 9 till 2, and again in the evening from 5 till 9. His diligence was so continuous and so regular that it became habitual. His biographer has said of him, "Work was his necessity. His studies were the calm of his life." And towards the last term of his glorious career, have frequently said that he still hoped to be able to consecrate to them a few more years. He was a most conscientious worker, always studying to give the reader his best thoughts, expressed in the very best manner. He was never wearied with touching and retouching his compositions, so that his style may be pronounced almost perfect. He wrote the Époques de la Nature not fewer than 11 times before he was satisfied with it, although he had thought over the work about 50 years. He was a thorough man of business, most orderly in everything, and he was accustomed to say that genius without order lost 3/4 of its power. His great success as a writer was the result mainly of his painstaking labor and diligent application. Buffon, observed Madame Necker, strongly persuaded that genius is the result of a profound attention directed to a particular subject, said that he was thoroughly wearied out when composing his first writings, but compelled himself to return to them and go over them carefully again, even when he thought he had already brought them to a certain degree of perfection, and that at length he found pleasure instead of weariness in this long and deliberate correction. It ought also to be added that Buffon wrote and published all his great works, while afflicted by one of the most painful dissesto which the human frame is subject. Literary life affords abundant illustrations of the same power of perseverance, and perhaps no career is more instructive, viewed in this light, than that of Sir Walter Scott. His admirable working qualities were trained in a lawyer's office, where he pursued for many years a sort of drudgery scarcely above that of a copying clerk. His daily dull routine made his evenings, which were his own, all the more sweet, and he generally devoted them to reading and study. He himself attributed to his prosaic office discipline that habit of steady, sober diligence in which mere literary men are so often found wanting. As a copying clerk was allowed 3_d underscore for every page containing a certain number of words, and he sometimes, by extra work, was able to copy as many as 120 pages in 24 hours, thus earning some 30_s underscore, out of which he would occasionally purchase an odd volume, otherwise beyond his means. During his afterlife, Scott was wont to pride himself upon being a man off business, and he averred, in contradiction to what he called the cant of sonneteers, that there was no necessary connection between genius and an aversion or contempt for the common duties of life. On the contrary, he was of opinion that to spend some fair portion of every day in any matter of fact occupation was good for the higher faculties themselves in the upshot. While afterwards acting as clerk to the Court of Session in Edinburgh, he performed his literary work chiefly before breakfast, attending the court during the day, where he authenticated register deeds and writings of various kinds. On the whole, says Lockhart, it forms one of the most remarkable features in his history, that through the most active period of his literary career, he must have devoted a large proportion of his hours, during half at least of every year, to the conscientious discharge of professional duties. It was a principle of action which he laid down for himself, that he must earn his living by business, and not by literature. On one occasion he said, "I determined that literature should be my staff, not my crutch, and that the profits of my literary labor, however convenient otherwise, should not, if I could help it, become necessary to my ordinary expenses." His punctuality was one of the most carefully cultivated of his habits. Otherwise it had not been possible for him to get through so enormous an amount of literary labor. He made it a rule to answer every letter received by him on the same day, except where inquiry and deliberation were requisite. Nothing else could have enabled him to keep abreast with flood of communications that poured in upon him, and sometimes put his good nature to the severest test. It was his practice to rise by 5 o'clock, and light his own fire. He shaved and dressed with deliberation, and was seated at his desk by 6 o'clock, with his paper serried before him in the most accurate order, his works of reference marshaled round him on the floor, while at least one favorite dog lay watching his eye outside the line of books. Thus, by the time the family assembled for breakfast, between 9 and 10, he had done enough, to use his own words, to break the neck of the day's work. But with all his diligent and indefatigable industry and his immense knowledge, the result of many years' patient labor, Scott always spoke with the greatest diffidence of his own powers. On one occasion he said, "Throughout every part of my career, I have felt pinched and hampered by my own ignorance. Such is true wisdom and humility. For the more a man really knows, the less conceited he will be." The student at Trinity College, who went up to his professor to take leave of him because he had finished his education, was wisely rebuked by the professor's reply, "Indeed, I am only beginning mine." The superficial person who has obtained a smattering of many things, but knows nothing well, may pride himself upon his gifts. But the sage humbly confesses that all he knows is that he knows nothing, or, like Newton, that he has been only engaged in picking shoals by the seashore, while the great ocean of truth lies unexplored before him. The lives of second-rate literary men furnish equally remarkable illustrations of the power of perseverance. The late John Britton, author of The Beauties of England and Wales, and of many valuable architectural works, was born in a miserable cot in Kingston, Wiltshire. His father had been a baker in Maltster, but was ruined in trade and became insane while Britton was yet a child. The boy received very little schooling, but a great deal of bad example, which happily did not corrupt him. He was early in life set to labor with an uncle Adiverne Keeper in Clockenwell, under whom he bottled, corked, and binned wine for more than 5 years. His health failing him, his uncle turned him adrift in the world, with only 2 guineas, the fruits of his 5 years' service, in his pocket. During the next 7 years of his life he endured many vicissitudes and hardships. Yet he says, in his autobiography, "In my poor and obscure lodgings, at 18 pence a week, I indulged in study, and often read in bed during the winter evenings, because I could not afford a fire. Traveling on foot to Bath, he there attained an engagement as a cellarman, but shortly after we find him back in the metropolis, again almost penniless, shoeless, and shirtless. Has succeeded, however, in obtaining employment as a cellarman at the London Tavern, where it was his duty to be in the cellar from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. His health broke down under this confinement in the dark, added to the heavy work, and he then engaged himself at 15 shillings a week to an attorney, for he had been diligently cultivating the art of writing during the few spare minutes that he could call his own. While in this employment, he devoted his leisure principally to perambulating the bookstalls, where he read books by snatches which he could not buy, and thus picked up a good deal of odd knowledge. Then he shifted to another office, at the advanced wages of 20 shillings a week, still reading and studying. At 28, he was able to write a book, which he published under the title of The Enterprising Adventures of Pizarro. And from that time until his death, during a period of about 55 years, Britton was occupied in laborious literary occupation. The number of his published works is not fewer than 87. The most important being The Cathedral Antiquities of England in 14 volumes, a truly magnificent work. Itself the best monument of John Britton's indefatigable industry. London, the landscape gardener, was a man of somewhat similar character, possessed of an extraordinary working power. The son of a farmer near Edinburgh, he was early inured to work. His skill in drawing plans and making sketches of scenery induced his father to train him for a landscape gardener. During his apprenticeship, he sat up 2 whole nights every week to study. Yet he worked harder during the day than any laborer. In the course of his night studies, he learned French, and before he was 18, he translated a life of Abelard for an encyclopedia. He was so eager to make progress in life that when only 20, while working as a gardener in England, he wrote down in his notebook, "I am now 20 years of age, and perhaps a third part of my life has passed away. And yet, what have I done to benefit my fellow men?" An unusual reflection for a youth of only 20. From French, he proceeded to learn German, and rapidly mastered that language. Having taken a large farm, for the purpose of introducing Scotch improvements in the art of agriculture, he shortly succeeded in realizing a considerable ensign. The continent being thrown open at the end of the war, he travelled abroad for the purpose of inquiring into the system of gardening and agriculture in other countries. He twice repeated his journeys, and the results were published in his encyclopedias, which are among the most remarkable works of their kind, distinguished for the immense mass of useful matter which they contain, collected by an amount of industry and labor which has rarely been equaled. The career of Samuel Drew is not less remarkable than any of those which were cited. His father was a hard-working laborer of the parish of St. Austell in Cornwall. Though poor, he contrived to send his two sons to a penny-a-week school in the neighborhood. Jabez, the elder, took delight in learning and made great progress in his lessons. But Samuel, the younger, was a dunce, notoriously given to mischief and playing truant. When about 8 years old, he was put to manual labor, earning 3 halfpence a day as a bottle boy at a tin mine. At 10 he was apprenticed to a shoemaker, and while in this employment he endured much hardship, living, as he used to say, like a toad under a harrow. He often thought of running away and becoming a pirate, or something of the sort, and he seems to have grown in recklessness as he grew in years. In robbing orchards, he was usually a leader, and as he grew older, had delighted to take part in any poaching or smuggling adventure. When about 17, before his apprenticeship was out, he ran away, intending to enter on board a man of war. But sleeping in a hayfield at night cooled him a little, and he returned to his trade. Drew next removed to the neighborhood of Plymouth to work at his homemaking business, and while at Cawsand, he won a prize for cudgel playing, in which he seems to have been adept. While living there, he had nearly lost his life in a smuggling exploit which he had joined, partly induced by the love of adventure, and partly by the love of gain, for his regular wages were not more than 8 shillings a week. One night, notice was given throughout Crafthole that a smuggler was off the coast, ready to land her cargo, on which the male population of Theplis, nearly all smugglers, made for the shore. One party remained on Therix to make signals and dispose of the goods as they were landed, and another manned the boats, Drew being of the latter party. The night was intensely dark, and very little of the cargo had been landed when the wind rose with a heavy sea. The men in the boats, however, determined to persevere, and several trips were made between the smuggler, no standing farther out to sea, and the shore. One of the men in the boat in which Drew was had his hat blown off by the wind, and in attempting to recover it, the boat was upset. 3 of the men were immediately drowned. The others clung to the boat for a time, but finding it drifting out to sea, they took to swimming. They were 2 miles from land, and the night was intensely dark. After being about 3 hours in the water, Drew reached a rock near the shore, with 1 or 2 others, where he remained benumbed with cold till morning, when he and his companions were discovered and taken off, more dead than alive. A keg of brandy from the cargo just landed was brought, the head knocked in with a hatchet, and a bowl full of the liquid presented to the survivors. And shortly after, Drew was able to walk 2 miles through deep snow to his lodgings. This was a very unpromising beginning of a life. And yet this same Drew, scapegrace, orchard robber, shoemaker, cudgel player, and smuggler, outlived the recklessness of his youth, and became distinguished as a minister of the gospel and a writer of good books. Happily, before it was too late, The energy which characterized him was turned into a more healthy direction and rendered him as eminent in usefulness as he had before been in wickedness. His father again took him back to St. Austell and found employment for him as a journeyman shoemaker. Perhaps his recent escape from death had tended to make the young man serious. Assuatly find him attracted by the forcible preaching of Dr. Adam Clarke, a minister of the Wesleyan Methodists. His brother having died about the same time, the impression of seriousness was deepened, and thenceforward he was an altered man. He began anew the work of education, for he had almost forgotten how to read and write. And even after several years' practice, a friend compared his writing to thetrices of a spider dipped in ink set to crawl upon paper. Speaking of himself about that time, Drew afterwards said, "The more I read, the more I felt my own ignorance. And the more I felt my ignorance, the more invincible became my energy to surmount it." Every leisure moment was now employed in reading one thing or another. Having to support myself by manual labor, my time for reading was but little, and to overcome this disadvantage, my usual method was to place a book before me while at meat, and at every repast I read 5 or 6 pages. The perusal of Locke's Essay on the Understanding gave the first metaphysical turn to his mind. "It awakened me from my stupor," said he, "and induced me to form a resolution to abandon the groveling views which I had been accustomed to entertain." Drew began business on his own account with a capital of a few shillings. But his character for steadiness was such that a neighboring miller offered him a loan, which was accepted, and success attending his industry, the debt was repaid at the end of a year. He started with a determination to owe no man anything, and he held to it in the midst of many privations. Often he went to bed supperless to avoid rising in debt. His ambition was to achieve independence by industry and economy, and in this he gradually succeeded. In the midst of incessant labor, he sedulously strove to improve his mind, studying astronomy, history, and metaphysics. He was induced to pursue the latter study chiefly because it required fewer books to consult than either of the others. "It appeared to be a thorny path," he said, "but I determined, nevertheless, to enter, and accordingly began to tread it." Added to his labors in shoemaking and metaphysics, Drew became a local preacher and a class leader. He took an eager interest in politics, and his shop became a favorite resort with the village politicians. And when they did not come to him, he went to them to talk over public affairs. This so encroached upon his time that he found it necessary sometimes to work until midnight to make up for the hours lost during fete. His political fervor became the talk of the village. While busy one night hammering away at a shoe sole, a little boy, seeing a light in the shop, put his mouth to the keyhole of the door and called out in ashral pipe, "Shoemaker! Shoemaker! Work by night and run about by day." A friend, to whom Drew afterwards told the story, asked, "And did not Urin after the boy and Strappin?" "No, no," was the reply. Had Apostol been fired off at my ear, I could not have been more dismayed or confounded. I dropped my work and said to myself, "True, true, but you shall never have that to say of me again." To me, that cry was as the voice of God, and it has been a word in season throughout my life. I learnt from it not to leave till tomorrow the work of today, or to idle when I ought to be working. From that moment, Drew dropped politics and stuck to his work, reading and studying in his spare hours. But he never allowed the latter pursuit interfere with his business, though it frequently broke in upon his wrist. He married and thought of emigrating to America, but he remained working on. His literary taste first took the direction of poetical composition, and from some of the fragments which have been preserved, it appears that his speculations as to the immateriality and immortality of the soul had their origin in these poetical musings. His study was the kitchen, where his wife's bellows served him for a desk, and he wrote amidst the cries and cradlings of his children. Paine's Age of Reason, having appeared about this time and excited much interest. He composed a pamphlet in refutation of its arguments, which was published. He used afterwards to say that it was the age of reason that made him an author. Various pamphlets from his pen shortly appeared in rapid succession, and a few years later, while still working at shoemaking, he wrote and published his admirable essay on the immateriality and immortality of the human soul, which he sold for £20, a great sum in his estimation at the time. The book went through many editions, and is still prized. Drew was in no wise puffed up by his success, as many young authors are, but long after he had become celebrated as a writer, he used to be seen sweeping the street before his door, or helping his apprentices to carry in the winter's coals. Nor could he, for some time, bring himself to regard literature as a profession to live by. His first care was to secure an honest livelihood by his business, and to put into the lottery of literary success, as he termed it, only the surplus of his time. At length, however, he devoted himself wholly to literature, more particularly in connection with the Wesleyan body, editing one of their magazines and superintending the publication of several of their denominational works. He also wrote in the Eclectic Review and compiled and published a valuable history of his native county, Cornwall, with numerous other works. Towards the close of his career, he said of himself, "Raised from one of the lowest stations in society, I have endeavored through life to bring my family into a state of respectability by honest industry, frugality, and a high regard for moral character. Divine Providence has smiled on my exertions and crowned my wishes with success." The late Joseph Hume pursued a very different career, but worked in an equally persevering spirit. He was a man of moderate parts, but of great industry and unimpeachable honesty of purpose. The motto of his life was perseverance, and well, he acted up to it. His father dying while he was a mere child, his mother opened a small shop in Montrose, and toiled hard to maintain her family and bring them up respectably. Joseph Shepard apprenticed to a surgeon, and educated for the medical profession. Having got his diploma, he made several voyages to India as ship surgeon, 115, and afterwards obtained a cadetship in the company service. None worked harder or lived more temperately than he did in securing the confidence of his superiors, who found him a capable man in the performance of his duty. They gradually promoted him to higher offices. In 1803, he was with the division of the army under General Powell in the Maratha War, and the interpreter having died, Hume, who had meanwhile studied and mastered the native languages, was appointed in his stead. He was next made chief of the medical staff, but as if this were not enough to occupy his full working power, he undertook in addition the offices of paymaster and postmaster and filled them satisfactorily. He also contracted to supply the commissariat, which headed with advantage to the army and profit to himself. After about 10 years' unremitting labor, he returned to England with a competency. One of his first acts was to make provision for the poorer members of his family. But Joseph Hume was not a man to enjoy the fruits of his industry and idleness. Work and occupation had become necessary for his comfort and happiness. To make himself fully acquainted with the actual state of his own country and the condition of the people, he visited every town in the kingdom, which then enjoyed any degree of manufacturing celebrity. Afterwards traveled abroad for the purpose of obtaining a knowledge of foreign states. Returned to England, he entered Parliament in 1812 and continued a member of that assembly, with a short interruption for a period of about 34 years. His first recorded speech was on the subject of public education, and throughout his long and honorable career, he took an active and earnest interest in that and all other questions calculated to elevate and improve the condition of the people. Criminal reform, savings banks, free trade, economy and retrenchment, extended representation, and such like measures, all of which he indefatigably promoted. Whatever subject he undertook, he worked at with all his might. He was not a good speaker, but what Hesed was believed to proceed from the lips of an honest, single-minded, accurate man. If ridicule, as Shaftesbury says, be the test of truth, Joseph Hume stood the test well. No man was more laughed at, but there stood perpetually, and literally, at his post. He was usually bidden on a division, but the influence which he exercised was nevertheless felt, and many important financial improvements were effected by him, even with the vote directly against him. The amount of hard work which he contrived to get through was something extraordinary. He rose at 6, wrote letters, and arranged his papers for Parliament. Then, after breakfast, he received persons on business, sometimes as many as 20 in the morning. The House rarely assembled without him, and though the debate might be prolonged to 2 or 3 o'clock in Fimmering, his name was seldom found absent from the division. In short, to perform the work which he did, extending over so long a period, in preface of so many administrations, week after week, year after year, to both voted, beaten, laughed at, standing on many occasions almost alone, to persevere in the face of every discouragement, preserving his temper unruffled, never relaxing in his energy or his hope, and living to see the greater number of his measures adopted with acclamation, must be regarded as one of the most remarkable illustrations of the power of human perseverance that biography can exhibit.